I took the job because I needed somewhere that stayed awake without asking much of me. That was the truth of it. I was 29, recently single, tired in the particular way that comes from too much noise spread over too many months, and looking for work that would let my thoughts settle back into some kind of order. I'd been doing front desk shifts at a chain hotel off the interstate for about a year, and I had grown to dislike almost everything about it. The lobby music, the bright carpet, the constant smiling, the way every guest expected the same polished voice no matter what hour it was. When I left, I told people I wanted something quieter. What I really wanted was something slower. That was how I ended up at the Briar Glen Motel, a low U-shaped place on the old state highway about 15 miles south of town. It had been built back when roads still curved through small places instead of skirting around them. Before the bypass, it had probably done very well. By the time I started there, the traffic had thinned to truckers, sales reps, night shift linemen, traveling nurses, hunters in season, and the occasional family who had taken the wrong exit and were too tired to keep driving. It was exactly the kind of place I had been hoping for. Not fancy, not memorable from the road. Just a quiet motor lodge with a front office, a flickering vacancy sign, a gravel edge where the asphalt met weeds, and a row of room doors painted the same dark green every few years, whether they needed it or not. There was an ice machine out by the second wing, a covered soda machine that hummed through all 4 seasons, and a drained swimming pool behind a chain-link fence that had been closed since before I was hired, and was mainly useful for collecting leaves. The office was my favorite part. It had wood paneling that had gone soft-looking with age, a bell on the counter that almost nobody rang unless they were angry or over 70, and a brochure rack full of local attractions that no longer existed in quite the form the brochures suggested. There was a coffee pot behind the desk, a microwave with a handle repaired in gray tape, a corkboard calendar, and a row of key hooks with large plastic number tags that clicked gently when you lifted them. At night, the office became even better. After 10, the road noise dropped into a steady, far-off hush, and the motel seemed to fold in on itself a little. The neon from the sign reflected dimly in the glass. Moths hit the outer light in soft, dry taps. If the weather was cool, you could smell damp pavement and pine sap from the trees behind the back fence. Some nights the whole place felt less like a business and more like a waiting room built at the edge of nowhere. That suited me. The owner was a woman named June Mercer. She was in her 60s when I started, maybe older, though she had the kind of face that had been handling practical matters for so long, it was difficult to guess where age ended and temperament began. She lived in a small apartment behind the laundry room and handled the books, supply orders, and daytime calls. I worked evenings into the overnight, usually from 4 in the afternoon until 6 or 7 the next morning, depending on who was coming in. There were other people too, though not many. Nadine did housekeeping 3 mornings a week and knew more about the private habits of travelers than anyone I've ever met. Wes came by for maintenance jobs and could fix anything except the lobby clock, which he claimed had decided years earlier to be inaccurate on principle. On Fridays, June's nephew Elliot stopped in to mow, haul trash, or replace light bulbs, but after dark, it was usually just me. I liked that from the start. My routine settled quickly. I would arrive before dusk, unlock the receipt drawer, check the reservation pad, count the cash float, and brew fresh coffee even if the old coffee was still hot. Then I'd walk the property once with a clipboard and a flashlight, more out of habit than necessity. Look at the ice machine. Make sure the hallway light near the laundry was on. Check whether anyone had left cigarette butts in the flower bed by room 3 again. straighten the brochure rack, fold a few bath towels if Nadine had left a basket. Little things like that. Then the evening travelers started coming in. A salesman with 2 sample cases and a tired tie. A line crew from farther west sharing 3 rooms and buying enough vending machine snacks to sound like raccoons after midnight. A nurse from the hospital in Pine Ridge who stayed twice a month and always asked for the room nearest the office because she hated parking in the dark. A retired couple with a little white dog and a cooler full of their own breakfast. The motel had its own small rhythm. People checked in, asked whether the diner across the road was still open, got disappointed when I told them it closed at 9, took their keys, and disappeared behind doors with the soft thud only motel doors make. Later, there would be showers running through the walls, muted television sounds, footsteps overhead if someone had been given one of the upstairs units in the front block, ice dumped into plastic buckets, car doors closing, then a long settling down. By midnight, on most nights, the motel became wonderfully still. The office lamp made a warm yellow circle over the register. The coffee tasted a little burnt. I could hear the soda machine compressor cycling on and off outside the door. If there were no late arrivals expected, I'd do a bit of reading between check-ins or sort the bills into their envelopes for June. Sometimes I watched the Weather Channel on the small television mounted in the corner, with the sound nearly off. Sometimes I simply sat with the road atlas open on the desk and followed routes I never planned to take. It was, in its own way, a peaceful life. The room came into it on my second night. I didn't know anything about it yet. Not really. I had noticed, during my first walk around the property, that room 8 looked a little more carefully kept than the others. Not nicer exactly, just more attended to. The curtain hung straighter. The brass number had been polished recently. The flower box under the window, though empty, had newer paint than the rest. At the time, I assumed June used it for storage or set it aside for some regular guest. At the start of my second shift, while I was checking the hooks, June slid a yellow index card across the counter toward me. "Read that," she said. I did. It had 4 lines written in neat, upright block letters. Room 8-1, never rented after midnight. 2, if the lamp is on, mark it occupied. 3, if the phone rings twice, take hot water, 2 cups, and clean towels to the chair outside. 4, never use the pass key before sunrise. That was all. I read it again, looked up, and asked what it meant. June was adding sugar to her coffee with the same calm she seemed to bring to every task. "It means exactly what it says," she told me. "Why would the lamp be on if nobody's rented it?" She stirred her cup once. "Sometimes it is. Is someone staying in it off the books?" "No." That answer should have settled the matter, but it didn't. Then who uses it? June took a sip of coffee and considered me over the rim. "You don't need to know that to work the desk," she said. "You just need the rules." I remember being more curious than uneasy. A small roadside motel can have any number of harmless secrets. A room kept aside for a relative, an old family arrangement, a standing favor for someone who came through irregularly and paid cash. I had worked front desks long enough not to imagine the worst whenever management sounded mysterious. So I folded the index card, put it under the reservation pad, and got on with the shift. Room 8 stayed dark all evening. By 11, I had checked in the last of the expected guests, locked the outer office door to night entry only, and heated a bowl of canned soup in the microwave. The motel felt especially still that night. A warm rain had started around 9, and by midnight the pavement outside shone under the office light in a way I've always liked. There is something comforting about rain at a motel. People tend to stay in their rooms. The cars gleam, The gutters start talking quietly to themselves. At about 1 in the morning, while I was washing my spoon in the tiny sink behind the desk, I noticed a line of pale gold through the rain. It was coming from room 8, just the bedside lamp, visible through the curtain gap. I stood there with the spoon in my hand for a few seconds, then dried it and looked at the occupancy board. Room 8 was still clipped with the green clean tag, unrented since that morning. I remembered the index card. If the lamp is on, mark it occupied. I crossed to the board, moved the tag aside, and marked room 8 occupied in pencil. Then I went back to my soup. That may sound simple, but I remember the exact feeling of it. Not fear, not even real suspicion. More the quiet prickle you get when a workplace turns out to have customs you do not yet understand. Like learning the freezer door has to be kicked twice before it seals, or that the office phone should not be answered on the first ring after midnight because it's usually a trucker with the wrong number. At 1:27, the desk phone rang. Once, then again. Not the main line, the internal line. A small second phone on the right side of the switchboard lit up with the number for room 8. I sat very still for a moment. Then I looked at the index card again. If the phone rings twice, take hot water, 2 cups, and clean towels to the chair outside. I did exactly that. The office kept an electric kettle for guests who preferred tea. I filled it, boiled it, set it on the small tray with 2 paper cups and a packet of sugar, then took 2 folded bath towels from the shelf and balanced the whole thing against my hip as I stepped out into the rain. Room 8 sat in the second wing, halfway down, with a wooden chair kept beside the door that I had assumed was there for smokers. The lamp glowed steadily through the curtain. Rain ticked on the metal roof above the walkway. The whole motel seemed to be listening. I set the tray and the towels on the chair. I knocked once, lightly, because the tray made noise against the wood. Then I turned and walked back to the office. That was all. No voice answered. No door opened while I was there. No shape crossed the curtain. When I checked again from the office 10 minutes later, the chair was empty. The kettle, cups, and towels were gone. I stood at the window for a while, watching rain slide through the parking lot light and trying to decide whether I had just helped serve some strange arrangement I had no business asking about. By morning, room 8's lamp was off. At 7:30, Nadine came in with her cart, and I mentioned, as casually as I could, that June had let a late guest use 8 after all. Nadine looked up from sorting washcloths and said, "Did she now?" The lamp came on, phone rang, I took over the tray. She kept folding for a second longer than necessary, then said, "And did you open it?" "No." "Good." That was all she gave me. When she cleaned room 8 later that morning, I found an excuse to be nearby. Not lurking exactly, just refilling the ice machine bucket slower than normal. Nadine came out after a few minutes with the same expression she had worn before. "Well?" I asked. She shrugged. "Used towels, little steam on the mirror. Nothing else." "No bags? No cups?" She looked at me as if deciding how young I was. "You'll make yourself miserable if you go asking a room to explain itself," she said, and pushed her cart along to room 9. That should probably have been enough for me. It wasn't. The trouble with quiet jobs is that small mysteries have room to breathe. After that first night, I began to notice room 8 the way you notice a loose floorboard after someone points it out. Not constantly, just often enough that it stayed somewhere in your peripheral thoughts. I would pass it on the evening walk, glance at the curtain, check the board, think about the index card in my drawer, and on most nights, nothing happened. The room was simply a room, But when it did happen again, it happened in the same calm, unquestioning way as before, which somehow made it stranger. The second time was about 10 days later on a dry, cool night in October. We had 3 truckers in rooms 2, 3, and 5, a young couple in 11, and a man from an insurance company in 6 who asked 3 times whether the Wi-Fi reached the lot. By midnight, everyone was settled. I had the office radio on low and was balancing the cash drawer when I happened to look up and see the lamp in room 8 already on. I had not seen it come on. It simply was. Again, I marked it occupied. Again, the phone rang twice not long after 1. Again, I took the kettle, 2 cups, and fresh towels to the chair. This time, as I turned back to the office, I heard something behind the door. Not a voice exactly. More the soft, ordinary sound of someone setting a suitcase down on a luggage rack. That sound bothered me more than anything else had. Not because it was frightening, because it was such a specific human sound. I know there are people who expect ghosts to announce themselves properly, but what stays with me from places like that is nearly always the domestic detail. A suitcase, a cup on a nightstand, water running briefly and then stopping. Things that suggest not horror, but use. The next morning, Nadine found something else. She came to the office holding a motel soap wrapped in paper. Only the paper looked wrong. We used plain white wrappers at Briar Glen with the motel name stamped in green. This one was cream-colored with a gold border and a little picture of a pine tree. "Found it on the sink in 8, she said. "It's not ours." It was once. I turned it over in my hand. The paper was dry and crisp, but yellowed slightly at the fold. "Old stock?" "Not from my time." June, when I showed it to her, barely looked up from the invoice book. "We used those years ago," she said. "How many years?" She shrugged. "Enough." She took the soap from me, put it in the desk drawer, and changed the subject to drain cleaner. That was the first moment I began to feel something deeper than curiosity. Not fear. Still not that. More the sense that everyone around me knew exactly how much of this they intended to live with. And I did not yet know my own limit. Over the next few months, the room became part of the motel's quieter weather. It never activated every night. There was no clear schedule, but there were patterns if you were working enough shifts to notice them. Rain made it more likely. So did fog. Holiday traffic, oddly enough, seemed to stir it too. The long weekends when tired people drifted off the highway later than they should have. Nights when the road itself felt more occupied than the motel. Sometimes the lamp would come on before midnight, but stay dark after 1, and nothing further happened. Sometimes the phone would ring twice, but the tray would remain untouched until morning. A few times, the room stayed dark, yet Nadine found damp towels inside the next day, as if someone had managed a full stay without ever showing themselves at all. And always, always, June treated it as no more remarkable than a leak in the gutter. One winter evening, when freezing rain had turned the parking lot into black glass, and even the truckers were coming into the office to stamp warmth back into their feet, I decided to ask more directly. June was in the back room labeling supply boxes. "How long has room 8 been like this?" I asked. She went on writing for a few seconds, then capped the marker. "Longer than I've had the place." "You bought the motel with the rules?" "Yes." "From who?" "The Haskins family." "And where did they get the rules?" She looked at me then. "From the people before them, I expect." That answer stayed with me because of its shape. Not defensive, not mysterious for the pleasure of it. Just matter of fact in a way that implied the rules were older than ownership. So nobody knows what started it? June rested a hand on the box top. "I didn't say that," she said. I waited. She sighed softly, the way people do when they know they are about to give you less than you want and more than they meant to. "The old road was different before the bypass," she said. "More wrecks, more people driving too long without stopping, more weather. My husband used to say there are roads that don't always let go of everybody who takes them." That was not a practical answer, and because it came from June, that made it worse. "What does that mean?" "It means we keep one room ready after midnight." "For who?" She looked at me a long time. "For travelers," she said at last. "And that is enough for the desk." That conversation might sound dramatic when repeated now. It wasn't at the time. She said it while adjusting labels on paper towel boxes. The fluorescent light buzzed. The dryer was running in the laundry room. She might as well have been explaining where we kept the spare pillowcases. That was one of the most unsettling things about the motel. Nothing strange there ever demanded a special tone. If anything, the motel seemed to prefer that you spoke softly around it. The first of what I think of now as the real stories happened the following spring. A paving crew had booked 6 rooms for 3 nights, which was busy for us. They were decent men, dusty and tired, up before dawn and asleep early. On the second night, around 1:30, while room 8's lamp was on and the kettle had already gone over, one of the crew came to the office in his socks and flannel shirt. He leaned on the counter and said, apologetically, "Sorry to bother you. Someone in the next room keeps trying my handle." He was in room 9. I felt the skin at the back of my neck tighten. "How long?" I asked. "Maybe 10 minutes on and off. Not banging or nothing, just trying it." "Did you look?" He shook his head. "Sounded like an old lady, maybe. Soft, like she couldn't get the key right." That description has stayed with me for years, not because it was frightening, because it was almost sad. I told him I'd move him to room 2, which was empty and farther from 8. He said he didn't need that much trouble, but I insisted and comped the change. While he packed, I stood under the walkway light between the rooms with the passkey in my pocket and did not look directly at room 8's curtain. The handle of room 9 was still. No voice, no second attempt. Just rainwater dripping from the gutter and the faint, bright line of room 8's lamp beneath its curtain. The crewman thanked me, took his new key, and went away half embarrassed. I spent the next hour at the office trying very hard not to imagine the wrong kind of person outside the wrong door. At 3 in the morning, the phone in the office rang once on the room 8 line, then stopped. Only once. That was the first time the room did something not covered by the rules. I stared at the switchboard until the light went dark, then left it alone. In the morning, Nadine found the tray still on the chair outside the door. The kettle was empty, though the cups remained stacked untouched. The towels were gone. On the carpet inside, just past the threshold, she found a line of fine road dust and one small wet leaf flattened as if it had come in on the hem of a coat. That was all. The second story happened in July, on the county fair weekend, when we were fuller than usual and everybody was a little less patient. If you've never worked a roadside motel during local event traffic, the atmosphere is hard to explain. People are not quite tourists and not quite locals. They arrive sticky from summer air, mildly irritated, already half regretting whatever plan brought them there. They want ice, directions, extra pillows, quieter neighbors, earlier coffee, later checkout. All ordinary needs, but compressed into a smaller space than usual. That Friday, every room was booked except 8. We never listed 8 online. June handled it by hand. And after midnight, it simply disappeared from the available board. Before midnight, though, if she needed the capacity, she sometimes rented it like any other room. That was the one part I never fully understood. The rules only began after midnight. Before then, room 8 behaved normally, or normal enough. On fair weekend, June had put a traveling knife salesman in there just after 6. He was a tidy little man in a tan blazer with a sample case and a way of speaking that suggested he'd been disappointing clerks for 40 years. He took the key, asked whether the room had air conditioning, asked whether the ice machine worked, asked whether we had an iron, then disappeared inside. At 11:30, he came to the office in a mood, said the room smelled faintly used, which I remember exactly because it was such a strange phrase. I told him housekeeping had turned all the rooms that afternoon. He said he knew what fresh bleach smelled like, and this wasn't it. He said the room smelled like raincoats and old dresser drawers. I offered him air freshener. He did not want air freshener. He wanted another room. We had none. He stood there a while with one hand on his sample case, and the stubborn look of a man who believed dissatisfaction was a skill. Then he said, "Fine, but someone has been at my door." I felt that familiar cold spot open in my chest. "It's not midnight yet," I said, which was not an answer to what he'd asked, and not something he could have understood anyway. He squinted at me. "What does that mean?" "Nothing. I'll walk back with you." So I did. The summer air was heavy, thumpful of cut grass and distant traffic, and the sweet, stale smell of the drained pool. The walkway lights buzzed. A television laughed somewhere through a wall. When we reached room 8, the salesman stood aside with performative patience while I unlocked the door. The room looked perfectly ordinary. Bed made, lamp off, bathroom light off, curtains still. Sample case where he had left it. I stepped back into the walkway and apologized. He accepted this like a man collecting proof of the world's gradual decline. Then he said something that shifted the shape of my thinking. As he took the key, he glanced once down the row of rooms and said, almost to himself, "Well, I hope they found the child." I looked at him. "What child?" He frowned at me as if I had missed something obvious. "The little boy. I heard a woman asking if he'd come by. Maybe 6 or 7. Thought it was next door." He went inside, shut the door, and that was that. There had been no woman in the row. No child checked into the motel. None of the fair families had come in with kids that small. I knew because I had handed out every key myself. I stood in the walkway for a long time after that, looking at the number on the door. At 11:58, the salesman returned to the office carrying his sample case. He said he had decided to drive to the Interstate Hotel after all. He did not want a refund, only a receipt. June, who had come in from the back apartment in her robe and slippers, wrote him one without comment. When he had gone, she looked at me and said, "Strip the room and close it. It's not midnight yet. It will be." I took the linens off the bed, unbagged the towels, opened the window for a minute, and stood in the room long enough to smell what he meant. Raincoats and old dresser drawers was not far off. A room smell, a travel smell, damp wool, cool air, old wood, a little soap, maybe a little powder. Not strong, but definite. Like opening a wardrobe in a house nobody has lived in for some time. I finished up, closed the window, shut the door, and locked it. At 12:17, the lamp came on. At 12:24, the phone rang twice. I took the kettle, 2 cups, and clean towels to the chair. That was also the first night I added anything of my own. Just 2 little wrapped peppermints from the office candy dish. I don't fully know why I did that. Perhaps because I had begun to think less of the room as a problem and more as a late arrival. A difficult guest, maybe. An irregular one. But still someone being accommodated. In the morning, the peppermints were gone. In their place, beneath the empty kettle, was a single coin. Not foreign, not antique in any special way. Just an old turnpike token from a road system in the next state over. The sort of thing people stopped using years before. I carried it in my pocket for a long time after that. Not as proof. More like a tip. The longer I worked the desk, the less frightened I became and the more careful. That may sound like the same thing. It isn't. Fear wants drama. Care wants procedure. By the second year, Room 8 had become part of my shift in the way weather was part of it. Some nights I watched for rain clouds and late traffic and knew I might be boiling the kettle after one. Some nights I didn't think of the room at all. The rules settled into my hands. I could follow them without much thought, which I suspect is what June had intended all along. And I started to understand the real reason for them. They were not there to protect me from seeing something unbearable. They were there to keep the motel itself calm. On the nights when Room 8 was handled properly, the rest of the property stayed quiet. Guests slept. Doors stayed shut. Phones rarely rang. But on the few occasions when someone ignored the shape of things, the unease spread. A new hire named Stacy, who lasted 9 days, once answered the internal line from Room 8 on the 3rd ring because she hadn't read the card carefully enough. She heard nothing at all, but for the next hour every vacancy light on the office board flickered on and off as if rooms were being rented and vacated faster than anyone could move. June unplugged the board from the wall and made Stacy go home early. Another time, Elliot, June's nephew, used the passkey on Room 8 at about 5 in the morning because he wanted to prove to himself that the whole thing was an old person's superstition. He came back pale and very annoyed, which on Elliot amounted to nearly the same thing as frightened, and said the room had been empty except for a wet suitcase print on the blanket and a bathroom mirror full of steam. From what? I asked. He snapped, I don't know. Humidity, and never tried the passkey again. After that, June added a 5th line to the card in red ink. The rules are cheaper than curiosity. She crossed it out a week later, perhaps deciding it sounded too much like an explanation. The most difficult part, for me, was that the room could feel ordinary enough to be kind about. There were nights I stood in the walkway, leaving the kettle and towels, and thought very clearly, whoever is in there has had a long drive. Not because I had seen them. I almost never saw anything directly. Once maybe I noticed the curtain move with the shape of someone sitting on the edge of the bed. Once I heard a child cough softly behind the door. Once I heard what might have been a radio playing from another decade, something thin and orchestral under the noise of summer insects. But mostly what reached me was the evidence of use. A towel gone. Hot water taken. An extra pillow asked for not with words, but with the office phone ringing twice again half an hour later, which June said counted. Still, a blanket left on the chair in the morning, folded more neatly than anyone at the motel ever folded blankets. That was what made the room hard to hate. It behaved less like a haunting and more like a difficult old arrangement everyone else had accepted years before I arrived. The climax of the whole thing came during an ice storm in January. It had been one of those bad weather days that never quite justifies headlines, but slowly makes everything dangerous anyway. Freezing rain all afternoon, trees snapping farther up the county road, cars sliding gently into ditches, The kind of weather that makes people come in with their shoulders high and their voices too polite because they are tired and embarrassed to be worried. By 10 that night, the motel was effectively full. A utility crew had taken the front block. 2 truckers had the end rooms. A middle-aged couple on their way to see family were in 10. The only true vacancy left was my small back office cot, which was not a room at all, just a narrow bed behind the laundry partition, where I sometimes slept for an hour near dawn if June had already started coffee. Room 8, of course, remained unrented. The rain had turned to sleet. The neon sign cast a red blur over the parking lot. I was finishing a second pot of coffee when a woman came in carrying a child, half asleep against her shoulder. He was maybe 7. Red knit hat, damp sneakers, the boneless heaviness children get when they've been woken too late and moved too far. The woman looked exhausted in the deep, controlled way of someone who knows there is no benefit in panic. She asked whether I had a room. I checked the board even though I knew the answer. I said, "I'm sorry. We're full." She nodded once and shifted the boy higher on her shoulder. Outside, her car was idling under the office light, an older sedan with steam rising from the hood line. "How far to the next place?" she asked. 26 miles north, I said. Maybe 30 to the interstate. She looked through the glass at the sleet and did not say anything for a few seconds. That was when I made the mistake of glancing at the key hooks. The green tag for room 8 hung there. Clean. Ready. Warm enough, almost certainly. The rule card lay in the drawer under my hand. Never rented after midnight. The clock said 12:41. There are moments in jobs like that, where the thing you know and the thing you can live with are not the same thing. I have never enjoyed sending tired people back into bad roads. I disliked it even before Briar Glen. And looking at that woman with a sleeping child and a car that sounded wrong through the glass, I felt the full cruelty of a rule I had obeyed for over a year without needing to measure it against a person standing directly in front of me. I did not give her room 8. I still think that was the right decision. But I came closer than I like to admit. Instead, I told her she could have the cot in the back office for a few hours, and I would make up a pallet on the floor with spare blankets for the boy. It was not much, and I knew that. But it was warm, dry, and off the road. Relief passed over her face so quickly it almost looked like shame. She thanked me more than the offer deserved. I got the blankets. I found an extra pillow. Now the boy woke long enough to ask whether there was a television and fell asleep again before I finished answering. I made them both instant cocoa in the paper cups we used for breakfast juice and showed her where the washroom sink was. It was nearly 2 by the time everything settled. The woman slept on the cot behind the partition. The boy was on a stack of folded quilts on the floor with June's old wool blanket over him. The office itself was dim except for the desk lamp and the parking lot glow. The storm had quieted into a fine, dry tapping at the windows. I remember feeling, for the first time in months, that room 8 had dropped low in my attention. Human need had taken the foreground again. The rules, the kettle, the quiet lamp under the curtain line, all of it seemed less pressing than the ordinary fact of keeping a stranger and her child warm until daylight. At 2:11, the lamp in room 8 came on. I saw it through the office window and said nothing. At 2:14, the phone rang twice. I closed my eyes for a second, then stood up. The woman stirred behind the partition and asked sleepily whether something was wrong. "No," I said, "just checking on the heat." That was a lie, though not the sort I regret. I filled the kettle, set out the cups, added the clean towels, On impulse, I took one of the small foil packets of instant cocoa, too. I do not know why. Perhaps because of the child. Perhaps because storms make you sentimental. Outside, the sleet had turned powdery, almost like sand. Room 8's curtain glowed softly. The chair waited where it always waited. I set down the tray and knocked once. This time, before I turned away, I heard something unmistakable from inside. A child laughing, not loudly, not wildly, just a brief, tired little laugh, followed by a woman's voice saying very gently, "Shh, now. We've got the room." I walked back to the office in a careful, even way that I am still oddly proud of. Inside, I checked the back partition first. The woman and her boy were both asleep exactly where I had left them. For the next 20 minutes, I sat at the desk and looked at nothing in particular. It is difficult to describe what I felt then without making it sound larger than it was. The motel remained still. The office heater hummed. A truck down the road changed gears. The world had not torn open. I had only heard, through the door of a room no one had rented, and a voice and a child that might have fit 100 roads in 100 winters. But I knew, with unusual certainty, that whatever Briar Glen was keeping room 8 for, it was not one traveler, and not one night, and not one old story that had hardened into superstition. It was a function, a courtesy. That thought stayed with me while I waited. At some point near 3, I must have drifted in my chair. I wasn't fully asleep, but my thoughts had loosened. I was brought back by a very small sound from the office door. The boy was standing there. He had woken without waking his mother and come barefoot across the office rug still wrapped in June's wool blanket. He looked at me with the wide, calm expression children sometimes have in the middle of the night, as if waking and dreaming are still on speaking terms. "There's a lady outside," he said. Every part of me went still. "Where?" He pointed toward the motel row. "By the green room." "What lady?" He thought about it. "Just a lady. She said I forgot my rabbit." "Do you have a rabbit?" He frowned slightly, then lifted one hand. He was holding a small, stuffed rabbit by one ear. Brown, flattened from use. Not something I had seen him bring in. "Did she give you that?" I asked. He nodded. I looked behind him. The office door was shut. Locked. The chain was still in place. I crouched until I was closer to his height and asked, as gently as I could, whether he had gone outside. "No," he said. "She was by the window." That answer chilled me more than anything else that whole year. Not because I imagined a face at the glass, because the office window looked directly toward the middle row of rooms, and room 8's light could be seen from it very clearly. I took the rabbit from his hand, not to keep it, only to look. It was dry, old-fashioned. One button eye missing. Around its neck was a little ribbon gone stiff with age. The boy asked if he could have it back. I said yes, of course. Then I wrapped the blanket more tightly around him and settled him in the desk chair with a packet of crackers from the snack basket while I went to wake his mother. I told her only that he'd gotten up and wandered a little, which was true enough. She thanked me, embarrassed and sleepy, and brought him back behind the partition. He clutched the rabbit without comment and went straight back to sleep. I did not mention the lady. I did not mention the window. At 3:26, the phone rang twice again from room 8. That was the only time I remember feeling truly tested by the rules. I had already taken the tray. The room had already received towels and hot water. The woman and her child were asleep not 15 feet from my desk. And yet the phone rang again, with the steady patience of someone who had not been fully served. I stood there a long time staring at the lit line on the switchboard. Then I did what the motel had taught me to do. I refilled the kettle. I took 2 fresh cups. I added another folded towel and, after a moment's thought, one of the little packets of powdered creamer we used for morning coffee. There was no reason for that, except that it felt, strangely, as though I were answering a need rather than a demand. Outside, the chair was empty, the first tray already gone. I set down the second. As I straightened, the door handle of room 8 turned once from inside. Not sharply, not trying the latch, just a gentle downward movement, then release. And for one suspended second, I knew with complete clarity that if I stood there waiting, the door would open. Rule 4 came back to me with such force it felt almost physical. Never use the passkey before sunrise. It did not say never wait for the door. It did not say never look. But I understood, standing there with the sleet whispering against the walkway roof and the lamp making a thin gold line under the door, that the meaning of the rule was wider than the wording. You gave the room what it required. You did not make it explain itself. I went back to the office without turning around. Nothing else happened before dawn. At 6:30, the storm had softened into plain cold rain. The woman and her son woke, grateful and embarrassed in the morning light, the way people often are after kindness from strangers. I made them coffee and toast from the emergency bread June kept in the freezer. The boy still had the rabbit tucked under his arm. When they were ready to leave, the woman asked me how much she owed for the night. I told her nothing. She tried to argue. I refused. She thanked me again, this time with tears very close to the surface but not spilling. Then she took the boy and the rabbit and went out to the car. After they drove away, I did the thing I had not been allowed to do for hours. I went to room 8. By then the lamp was off. The chair outside the door held the second kettle, empty and warm, the cups nested one inside the other, the towel folded. Beside them sat one more object, a child's red knit mitten, dry, clean, too small for the boy who had slept in the office, too old-fashioned in shape besides, with the thumb set low and the yarn a little rougher than modern store-bought ones. I carried it back to the office and set it on the counter. June came in not 10 minutes later, took one look at my face and asked what I'd done. That irritated me at the time, though now I understand why she phrased it that way. A motel survives on routine. If something feels wrong, you first look for the broken step in the ordinary process. I told her everything. Not dramatically, just the facts. Full house, woman and child in the back office, lamp on, 2 calls, voice in the room, boy with rabbit, handle turning, mitten on the chair. June listened without interrupting, and then picked up the mitten and turned it over in her hand. After a moment she said, "You didn't open it?" "No." "You didn't rent it?" "No." She nodded. "Then you did fine." That answer bothered me. "June," I said, "what exactly are we doing for that room?" She leaned one hip against the counter and looked out through the office glass toward the wet morning parking lot. "The same thing every roadside place used to do," she said. "What's that?" "Make space." "For who?" This time she answered more plainly than ever before. "For the ones who arrive late," she said. "That doesn't mean anything." "It means enough." I must have looked more tired than I felt, because she softened then, just a little. "When my husband was alive," she said, "he used to travel county roads for equipment sales. Before the bypass, before good service stations, before everybody carried a bright little map in their pocket. He said there were nights the road changed character after midnight. Not haunted, not cursed, just full of people who had meant to stop somewhere and didn't. Old motor courts understood that better than chain places do now. I asked whether she believed Room 8 held dead people. June frowned at the word as if it were clumsy. "I believe the road doesn't always empty all at once," she said. That was the closest she ever came to explaining it. After that storm, I stopped thinking about Room 8 as a single mystery and started thinking of it as part of an older etiquette. Something passed down not because anyone had solved it, but because they had learned the cheapest and kindest way to coexist with it. That changed my feelings more than my actions. I still followed the rules exactly. I still never opened the room before sunrise. I still marked it occupied when the lamp came on and carried the kettle over when the phone rang twice. But I no longer felt I was standing outside the door of a problem. I felt I was working at a place that had remembered one of hospitality's older duties and never quite let it go. That made certain nights gentler. Not all of them. There were still moments that unsettled me. A shape at the curtain. The clear impression of a family checking in without ever approaching the office. The morning Nadine found 4 damp handprints on the bathroom counter in a room no one had officially used. The time a state trooper staying in room 7 mentioned over coffee that he had heard someone wheeling a suitcase up and down the walkway around 3 and wondered who was arriving that late in weather like ours. But the room itself never harmed me. It never even pushed very hard against the edges of its rules. That, more than anything, is why I can tell the story calmly now. The aftermath, if there was one, was simple enough. I worked another year at Briar Glen, long enough to learn which guests preferred ground floor end rooms, which vending machine buttons stuck in humid weather, and how to reset the lobby television with a ruler when the remote batteries failed. Long enough to see Room 8 active on quiet autumn nights and crowded holiday weekends, and once, memorably, during a spring thunderstorm so warm the whole parking lot smelled like wet dirt and honeysuckle. Long enough that the rules became mine too. When June retired and sold the place to a couple from out west, I left not long after. The new owners wanted online booking software, brighter paint, electronic locks, and a breakfast bar. None of that was unreasonable, but it meant the Briar Glen I had known was ending, and I had the feeling, which I still can't prove, that Room 8 belonged to the old version of the place more than the new one. On my last week, June gave me the yellow index card, the one with the 4 rules. She had rewritten it neatly on fresh stock. No explanation. No ceremony. Just handed it across the desk while I was sorting receipts. I asked why. She said, "In case you work a desk again." I laughed and asked whether she thought the room would follow me. She did not laugh back. "Not the room," she said. "The kind of place." I kept that card. For years it sat in the back of my wallet until the edges wore soft. Eventually, I put it in a kitchen drawer with takeout menus and spare batteries and the turnpike token from the kettle tray. I still have both. A few years after Briar Glen, I was driving alone through western Pennsylvania on a work trip and got tired enough that I decided to stop before the interstate hotels. I took an old exit instead and found a low motor lodge that looked as though it had been built around the same time as ours. Brick office, soda machine under a shelter, one long row of rooms with outside doors. The desk clerk was a tired man in a cardigan. While he was making my key, I noticed, taped behind the counter, a small white card with writing on it. I couldn't read the whole thing from where I stood, only the bottom half. But I saw enough. I saw the words after midnight. I saw hot water. And I saw before sunrise. I didn't mention it. He gave me room 5. I thanked him and carried my bag outside. Halfway down the row, I passed a room with no number on the door. The curtain was drawn, but a lamp was on inside, making the fabric glow softly against the dark. A wooden chair sat beside the door. On it was a kettle. I kept walking. That, more than anything June ever said, convinced me that Briar Glen had not invented anything. It had only remembered. And once you start noticing old roadside places, you begin seeing little signs of the same memory everywhere. A room not listed on the vacancy chart. A lit lamp in the far unit no one was checked into. A folded towel on a chair under an eave. Clerks who don't look confused when a room is said to have been used without being rented.